I'd like to just take now, instead of going through the text, because we did it already once, the mitzvahs from 1 to 4 were very difficult, so I had to go over them because I don't know if I really did them the first time. But I like to just take various points in mitzvah chaf and chaf aleph and try to move here. Okay. The mitzvah chaf is a mitzvah b'inyan beis avoda, beis abchira, beis hamikdash. We'll see exactly what it is. Ram lists a whole a list of things. We discussed this in Shiur Beis, and over here, this is not what I want to get into now. What is the mitzvah? What's included in the mitzvah? Hu yisal oma v'osli mikdash, v'losh sifri, sholosh mitzvah. So it says osli mikdash. And then afterwards it says sholosh mitzvah nesavu Yisrael b'knisas la'aretz limnois lehem melech limnois lehem beis abchira v'lachizar shal hamelech. All this hinei nisbaya shebinya beis abchira mitzvah b'fnei atzma. So here's a very odd thing. What is the mitzvah? The mitzvah is binya beis hamikdash, binya beis abchira. He's tana b'chitim hol b'serim. He starts off with the Oseli Mikdash and Beis Avoda, and then he moves over to Beis HaBechira. So here, maybe the Ram learns the mitzvahs Beis HaBechira, and that's what he stresses over here, and that's his raya that it's a mitzvah. And the Siyum Mitzvah Aseh, the Ram says very clearly, he writes, Ukeshish Tachlel, Kol Elo Mitzvah Shekodam Zichom, Hine Timsa Mehem, Mitzvahs Shehem Choyva Atzibo, Loi Kol Ish Ve'ish, Kegoin Binyan Beis HaBechira. So they also, he says, the mitzvah is Binyan Beis HaBechira. And that's the Sifri that the Ram quotes here in the Gemara Sanhedrin. Amav Yosi Shlosh Mitzvah Nesavu Yisrael, Gisen Loretz. And this the Bais Hashem is Javos Hashem. However, the Rambam in Protei Mitzvahs, even though he calls it Hilchos Beis HaBechira, he says Livnois Beis HaMikdash. And when the Rav said Shiurim, Rabbi said Shiurim on the first parak of Beis HaBechira, he clearly says that the diuk in Rambam is that there was a kiyum. There was a kiyum in Binyan Beis HaMikdash, not only with the Beis HaBechira in Yerushalayim, but also in Shiloh and Nova Givon. So the Ram says like this. V'osli mikdash v'alisparish b'teira mishkan l'fisha shene'ema kilbosam arota v'chulei kiven shenichnesu le'oretz hemidu hamishkan begilgol Arba Esrishona, and then he goes through Shiloh and Nova Givon. And he goes through the whole thing. So the Rav said, the Choy see from this, the Kiyum Binyan Beis HaMikdash, not only with Beis HaBechira, but with everything that preceded it. So, if you look closely, the Rambam, both over here and in Mishnah Torah, doesn't differentiate when it comes to the mitzvah between Mikdash and Beis HaBechira, because he says at the beginning it's Beis Avoda, And then he goes to base of Bechira. And in Mishnah Torah also, he starts with Mishkan, Gilgal, Neuvig, Shiloh, Neuvigivon. And then he goes to base of Bechira. So I would assume in Rambam that in both Beis HaMikdash and Beis HaBechira, there's a kiyum in V'yoseli Mikdash, and that's the pasuk that he quotes. However, after Bechiras Mokim, the mitzvah is in Yerushalayim B'davka, and that's Beis HaBechira. Beis HaBechira redefines what the mitzvah is after Bechiras Mokim. But prior to Bechiras Mokim, the mitzvah includes any mikdash, whether it was Neuvig Givon or Shiloh or Gilgal or Mishkan itself. There is an issue of what defined the Bechiras Mokum and how it happened, whether it was Wayadei Binyan Shlomo or it was Ayadei David. The Rav talks about this in Gam Vagrid. It was based on Bechira Perek Vav Aloch Yadalit. But this is l'chor not our Indian. Whatever it is that there's a mitzvah based on Bechira. The mitzvah's bikdash is miskayin duch based on Bechira, but it's only after Bechiras Mokim. And b'chol Bechiras Mokim, it's any mikdash. That's what's happening in Rambam. Now, secondly, the Rambam says, "Kvar b'yanu shezeh klal." Klal, zeh klal. It means the whole, the klal, which is called mikdash, which is you look at Sheresh Yud Beis, that there's a mitzvah klalis of Osli mikdash and Kama Pratim. He discussed that at the beginning of Sheresh Yud Beis Baruka. But zeh klal koil chalokim u'shamenoira v'ashulchan mizbeach v'zulasam. So everything is mikdash. The kelim also part of mikdash. And this is not only here in Sheresh Yud Beis v'akach bo letayeh chalokov of mikdash v'eich yaseh v'ein roi shimne kol ma she'oma boy v'yosisa mitzvah b'fnei atzvah sisa menorah mizbeach, whatever it is. So all is included in the mitzvah. And it was based on Bechira in Perek Aleph halacha hey and vav ve'elu advorim shem ikar b'binyan habayis v'yach v'chulei v'yachshav ha'mikdash v'oisen b'mikdash shiva kelim mizbeach li'oilo all the kelim that he mentions, okay? Shulchan ushloshton b'toich ha'hektish b'toich hakodesh lifnei hakodesh hakadoshim. It's shulchan menorah and mizbeach hapnimi. So it means that all these kelim are chelkei hamikdash, and maybe that's the Ram v'shitosai, that he's ready to say that if you make the kelim, there's an isa of tavnis or isasuniti. So the Rambam learns that this problem is a problem of Yiras HaMikdash, and that's what he quotes in Perek Zayin Alocha Aleph Mitzvah Say Li'Yirah Min HaMikdash Shem HaMikdashi Tirou. And in the continuation in Alochas of Dinim HaMikdash, he writes in Hilchos Beis Bechira in Perek Zayin Halacha Yud the also la'odem sheyase bayis tavnis heichel achsadu tavnis ulam chotze hineged azora shulchan b'tzur shulchan. So the shulchan is a problem of Yiras HaMikdash making a shulchan a menorah. Avol oisehu menorah shel chamisha and not shiva or shmoyne v'chule. So this is beautiful, the Ram, the Taimei, as opposed to the Ramban that says in Hasogas to Aseh Lamed Gimel that the Kalim are not part of the mitzvah of Aseh Mikdash, but they're part of the Avodah. So you can imagine, and that's the Ram Paskins Lamaisa, that the Tavnis Kalim is a problem of Yus HaMikdash, because they are the Mikdash, they're part of the Mikdash. To this, okay, Beseder, that's the Ram. This, again, is not like the Ramban, which we pointed out, in Asogol Aseh Lamed Gimel, and not like Absadi going in the new Sefer HaMitzvos that was published in Perek Yudalid, page 110, Sheish Mitzvah Asiyas HaMikdosh, Asiyas HaMikdosh LaHashem, Sheyochu Boi Eiroi, Hanikra Shechina. The purpose of the Mikdosh is to have Shechina. And he learns that the Kalim are separate mitzvahs, as in Perek Yudalid. So it's not part of the Mikdash. The Mikdash is for Shechina, and then it happens to be Kalim. Where the Kalim are part of the Avodah, and the Avodah, or the Asiyas Kalim, whatever it is seems to be a mitzvah. Whether it's because he passes the Echshem mitzvah minion, that's really not an Indian now. Okay, now, next. However, in Rambam, even though the Rambam counts, and he says, שהמנורה והשולחן והמזבח וזולוסם. What's zulosam? Is l'cheira the rest of the 7 kalim, because the Ram lists 7 kalim in Hilchos Beis HaBechira, which we mentioned before, and that's the Rav. The Rav's whole piece was based on, because the published version of the Ram did not have Shiva kalim, and he found the Ksav Yad B'lid Shiva kalim, but now we realize that that's the Ksav Yad, and all of Frankel's Ram is the ones that whatever it's published Shiva kalim, but then it was a big discovery. So Mizbeach Achitzon is also part of Mikdash. Shulchan, Menorah, Mizbeach, but not Oren. And the interesting thing is that you would have assumed, the way the Rambam is learning, that he says in Shir Beis that the mitzvah is defined in the general sense. You make the broad mitzvah of Aseh Mikdash, and then the Torah goes about to define the various sub-commandments which together coalesce together and become the mitzvah. And the first one mentioned is Asiyas Aaron. So one would have assumed that all is part of the mitzvah, but the Rambam doesn't seem to say that. However, interesting, HaMitzvah she'kol al-isam haklal hu asiri heim asher sifalnu b'hilchos Beis HaBechira v'tzivonu anachnu shenivne heichal l'shmo yis'ale v'nosim boi ha'orein שיש בו שני לוחי סבונים שבוהן אנוכי ולא יהיה לך. It's interesting, אנוכי לא יהיה, because in Piagvura, that's why it's Chal Hashem, in the luchais, because they were said directly from God to Bnei Yisrael. I don't know, but that's what he has. Okay, the Rambam Ki'ilu. So what it is, Imo Nevuchim has a whole different shita, and the Oren is part of the Mikdash. But Mishnah Torah, we pointed out, it's only Shiva Kalim. That's the Rav was Medayik. That all is not included. and it's only a separate halacha, as he points out in Igus Agrid Halevi in Perek Aleph, the Bechira halacha Zayin, that it's the mikdash. It's just the din that the mokoim ha'oroin is in the mikdash, but it's not part of the mitzvah seis hamikdash. That's what he said. You look at the letters farther back and forth about this. Now, let's start now another inyan, which is a very interesting inyan. The inyan is like this. The Torah says, Mizbeach avonim taseli. And you have to realize there's a Pashas Truma of Yoseli Mikdash, and Mizbeach avonim taseli is in Pashas Yisra. So a priori, whatever you're talking about, the Oseli Mikdash and the Mizbeach avonim taseli, Mizbeach adom taseli, l'chayra are two disparate mitzvahs. Okay, so l'fumriyata, Mizbeach avonim taseli should be a separate mitzvah in minyan mitzvahs. And if you look at the psukim, Mizbach Adomo, Mizbach Avonim, all the psukim there had nothing to do with Mikdash, as we pointed out. The Mishkan wasn't even mentioned yet. So that's what Ram asks. Om the moment Mizbeach Adom Taseli, Sheyechoshev B'kosav Azeh, Shehi Mitzvah Fnei Atzmo, Chutz Mitzvah Mikdash, and that's what he's going to go out and explain. Now, he answers, Hoyin Boshi Sapel Cholam Pasha the Kohi, Badabe Bishas Heta Bomois, Shehoyim Mutalonu, Bisman Shinas Mizbeach Adomo, Bechol Mokav. So here is a very interesting thing. He says that the Pshuto Shomikro is Bom. So I'm not sure exactly why. The Ram could have ended the discussion very simply and said Bomo is Harashah, and because of Shorish Gimel, it's not Mina Mitzvahs. But the Ram doesn't say that. He doesn't mention word about Harashah. And if you look very carefully at what he's saying, he says, Shahoya Mutalonu Bismanahu Shenase Mizbeach Avona B'chol Mokem. So it seems to have a tzivui of Mizbach Adom Taseli, but he says, Pshuta Shomikro, there's no mitzvah to make a Mizbach Adomo, it's only a heter. And even if you count the mitzvah with Shalom Ashah, you would not have counted Mizbeach Adom Taseli. Okay? So that's what he's trying to do over here. Okay? We don't know why he's working so hard. He could have just said it's a Ashah, but that's what he did. That's Pashte the call. Ukvar omu aleim hasholem, ki inyan zehu shetzivo livnois mizbeach v'chule. So the Rambam now makes an about face and does an amazing thing. He says, according to the Matike Shmuel, this heter, Mizbeach Adom Taseli, is a mitzvah. That is according to the Matike Shmuel. So the Pirush HaMekubal says that it's a heter. The Pasha the Kos says it's a heter, and the Pirush HaMekubal from Matike Shmuel says that there's a mitzvah. So since according to Pirush HaMekubal, it's the mitzvah, maybe it should be a separate mitzvah. And that's the Ram is trying to answer. וכבר אמרו עליהם השלום, כי עניין זה הוא שציוו לבנוס המזבח שהם מחובר לאדומו. So before, if you look at the Rambam, Mizbeach Adomo is the material that the Mizbeach is made out of. Shehoya muta lanu bizman hahu shenase Mizbeach Adomo b'chol mokem. He seems to be learning this Nara Inyan, and it's a problem in the Gemara and everything. We show you don't find this thing that the Boma was made of Adoma. And then the Pirush Mekubal redefines what the word Adoma is, and doesn't mean the material that the Mizbeach is made from, but it means that the Mizbeach should be connected to the Karka. Ki inyan zehu shetzivu livnois Mizbeach shehei mechuba ba'aretz ushelo yihye ne'atak umetulto. Lashon, double lashon is odd. But the l'choi means that it's connected to the ground. Kamo shehoya b'midbar. It's not okay. That's what he using this in introduction. Kamo shehoya b'midbar. It's mechuba. In other words, after midbar, the mizbeach became connected to the ground. It wasn't portable. V'u amroi b'mechilta Rabbi Yishmael b'peirush ze apostle. It's a Pirush Mekubal. Kishetikonis la'oretz aseh l'mizbeach ha'mechuba ba'adomo. And that the Pirush Mekubal is one, and the Pashnakor is something else. V'kashehoya dova kain. Since that's true, it's not a Rosh Hashanah, and it's not referring to Boma. According to Matiki Yashmu, Mizbeach Adomo is a plot, is a chelkei mitzvah of mitzvahs mikdash, even though mikdash wasn't even mentioned. That's what the Pirush Mekubal says. It's an amazing thing. So that's what happened to you. So again, the word Adomo is completely changed from the Pshuta Shomiko and the Pirush Mekubal, and the Ram said that shouldn't bother us. But then the Ram does something which a priori is something very strange from a writing, an organizational point. It seems to be very odd, because the Ram adds on to a sentence. So avona man dochashmei. So you would have said it's a hakdama to what he's saying later, and he's writing the answer before he says anything. Ubemechilta Amru beferish Amru yisale im misbach avonim taseli Amru Rabbi Yishmael oimer Amru Rabbi Yishmael oimer im kol im v'im shebatera rishus chutz mishleisha echo mehem mizbach avonim taseli Amu v'im mizbech avonim chayva hatoim chayva eno rishus tamulayma mizbach avonim shleim is tivus mizbech Hashem lokech. So l'chera, the Ram is writing in a very odd way. He starts talking about mizbech avonim be'echach, and then he calls him mechilta. See, he should have said mizbeach zu shel avonim k'mavu mechilta. So I think the answer is very simple. What happened is that the Rambam quoted, you see, this mechilta at the beginning, the first mechilta he quotes, Mechilta, which he calls Mechilta Rabbi Yishmael, which we hear in Mechilta Rabbi Shimon Yochai, in Perek Chof, Pasuk Chof Aleph. The Ram only quotes part of it. Okay? He quotes a part, Befeish, the Apostle, Shikonis La'oretz, Aseh li Mizbeach HaMechuba B'Adomo. But he doesn't quote the rest of it. And it's an odd thing, but I think that's what's happening. He is now referring, when he writes, what's Eloi Meshivna Mizbach Me'avonim Behechach, to a part of this Mechilta which he hasn't quoted. Let me read it to you. Mizbeach Adom Taseli Yochol Adom Vadai. You see, in the word hechach is very odd. What's behechach? Okay, behechach. So the word, it says in the text of the Ram, where it's Eloima, Sheyivne Mizbech Me'avonim behechach. Okay, so interesting. The Ibn Tibbon and Ibn Eoy say behechach, but Kapach says bedafka, dafka. So what's dafka? Why dafka? To listen to the Mechilta of Shimon Yochai. Ma nema l'cho mizbeach adom taseli yochel adom vadai. Maybe the material is adomo kalmaloi ma'avonim shleimois tivne es mizbach Hashem Elokecha. So the vadai is not the mizbach adomo. It's avonim shleimus tivnes mizbach Hashem Elokecha. So what's the pshat in Adomo? Adomo is that it should be connected to the karka. Because she calls la'oretz, Aseh li mizbeach mechuba b'Adomo, Tivne Rabbi Yehuda. And this is what the Ram is quoting the Mechilta, Shedikonis la'oretz mechuba l'karka. But he doesn't quote the other part, that the mizbeach should be nasa ba'avonim. But he says, when he talks about it, it has to be avonim. It's not. It's not Adomo, because Adomo is not the material. Adomo is Mechubal Karka. How can it be Lehechach when the Pasuk says, V'im Mizbach Avonim Taseli? The Torah says Dachushus. That's what he answers. The Rabbi Yishmael says the Mizbach Avonim is Choiva. So his Mamish Lashon Ram is beautiful. That I've said, but say the Lashon Ram bothered me very, very much for a long, long time. And when I discovered this, I was Mamish dancing because I think it's Pashup Shat Ram. Next. One could ask, with the Chavaloch of Makriv Afrishem bias, so here you see the Mizbeach is Choluk for Mikdash, and maybe that should be a Raya, that should be a separate mitzvah. So comes, I would say the answer is like this. When you make a Mizbeach from Makriv and Afar Pishein bias, there's no kima mitzvah. It's just a hetak chova. The kiyum of asiyas mizbeach is only as much as a chelik for mikdash. A similar thing you find that the Rav said that midas hamizbeach is only in Beis HaBchira, in Beis HaMikdash, because it was halacha of a korban ksav. But in Makriv Avshem Bayis, there's no din of midas mizbeach. He says this in Chedush Agam V'Agrid, Hilchos Beis HaBechira, Perek Beis Halacha Yud Zayin. But the answer is that the mitzvah of Mizbeach Avonim or Mizbeach Adoma, which is part of the mitzvah of Mikdash, is only when there's a Mikdash. And the Mizbach of a Makriya Pishim Bayis is only a heter. Now, here you have another case I want to introduce to you. Another case of a stira between Makriv and Af Pishein Bayis, between Pshuto Shel Mikra and a Pirush Mekubal. Here you have a posuk of in Har Evo of Avodim Shleimus Tivne as Mizbach Hashem Elokecha. So this posuk in Dvorim Chav Zayin posuk Vov was said like Har Evo. And Har Evo is the Chayah Shah when they came over there, when they went Transjordan. So how can the Mechilta quote Mizbah Avodim Shleimois Tivnes Mizbah Hashem Elokecha as a Raya Doch? Rabbi Shmuel quotes a Raya Doch that the din is a Chayiv. Atoch the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Mizbeach Avodim is a Chayiv. It's not only a heter. It's not only a im. It was shus. Or the whole Avodim Shleimois was only said in Har Evo. Har Evo is the Chayah Shah. So the answer is again the Pshuta Shel Mikra. It's a Rasha. But the Matiki Hashmua, Rasha in Har Evo. But the Pirush Mekubal is that it's a mitzvah l'deiros. Livnos is bech shebe mikdash me'avonim shleimois. And this is just the similar what we said in Mizbach Adomo, that the Pshuta Shel Mikra is a bomo, and the Matiki Hashmua, it means that it's mechubal l'karka. Okay. And okay, say them. Next. This is the Rambam. In Hilchos Beis HaBechira, Perek Aleph Halacha Yudalid and Tezvav, Kol Even Shenifgamo, Kedei Shetachah Bo Tziporet B'Sakin Shel Shchita, Hare Zu Psula, so Psula, Lekevesh U'Mizbeach. Shenema Avodim Shleimus Tivne as Mizbach Hashem. Va'boine Even Pogum Oiv Baseh. So the Ram quotes Avodim Shleimois, and he says that you violated an Aseh of not, but he talks about, doesn't talk about the Aseh of Yosli Mikdash, he talks about the Aseh of Avodim Shleimois Tivnes Mizbach Hashem Elokecha. So that's what someone asked the Radvaz a question in Shas Shuvas Radvaz, L'Shas Rambam, Perek Aleph Halacha Tezvav. And he asked them, it should have been not the Aseh of Avodim Shleimois, V'kashalon, amalei mono isamorav b'chlal minyan mitzvahs. He should have quoted. He should have counted a mitzvah of avodim shleimus. Tivis v'zach Hashem elokecha. So the Shuvas Radvaz, and what he says is, I think, that which would not moinech chelkei mitzvahs is a din miyuchad in minyan mitzvahs, but the chelkei mitzvahs remain mitzvahs, so you can have from them. You can be saved over Aseh. It's not that there's no Aseh, but all the Aseh are common and merge in minyan mitzvahs, the one mitzvah. But there are many mitzvahs over here. So you can call an Isa Aseh of avodim shleimus tivnes mizvach Hashem elokecha. And then he says, even if you say it's something separate, the Ram doesn't count Isur Aseh. Okay, that's all very nice. But the next step, what about the Ashora of Negiyas Barzel? The Ram quotes in Luchos Beis HaBchira, V'haboine in Perek Aleph Hatocha Tezvov, Haboine even Shenoga Bo Barzel, B'mizbeach or B'kevesh, Loike Shnema, Loisivnes and Gozis. And in Minyan Mitzvah Kotze, Shol Livnois, Avnei Mizbeach Gozis, Shnema Loisivnes and Gozis. And Minyan Mitzvah Loisase Ayin Tes, Hishis Hanu Milivnois, Mizbeach Me'avonim, Shenoga Bohem Barzel. V'omo Yis'ale Loisivnes and Gozis. Ki Chabachoy Nafta Chalel, V'im Bono, Mehem Mizbeach Hu Posel, V'lo Yakribu Olov. So you have to ask yourself a question. Binyan Mizbeach is a chelik from Binyan HaMikdash. And it's not a separate mitzvah, it's part of Binyan HaMikdash. So why do you count? And that therefore you don't count avodim shleimus, because it's part of Binyan HaMikdash. So why are you same thing? There was the same way avodim shleimus was said in the Mizbeach. There was a lav of Negiyas Barzel which said in the Mizbeach, and that you do count. So the answer is simple. In the reason why you don't count avodim shleimus, because all the tzivuyim merge into one big mitzvah of Aseh Mikdash, as the Torah said. But that you can only do in mitzvah Aseh. And mitzvah lois Aseh, the lois Aseh is not merged into the mitzvah. It's a separate thing, and it's counted separately. The same way there's a mitzvah chatos, and you count all the various parts of chatos, whether it's miku shtifa or kibbutz dam chatos, or the avodah of the korban chatos. When it comes to lo yavdil, which was said in Melikas chatos oif, we count it as a separate mitzvah because you only count the tzivuyim as in chalkei mitzvah, but not the ashoros, not the lois aseh. So the Rav in V'yosem Mikdash in Perek Aleph Halacha Vav Beis HaBchira, V'yosem Mikdash Shiva Kalim Mizbeach Loylo L'Shakol V'chulei, and the key of V'chulei, and he talks about the Zayin Kalim. But what about the Kalim from the Ketores, and the Kalim from Mizbeach, and the Kalim from Shulchan? The Kalim from Mizbeach HaPnimi, the Kalim from Menorah? Why aren't they counted? That the Rav asks in Igus Agrida Levi, Perek Aleph Beis HaBchira Halacha Vav, to Ramascha V'su. So the Rabbi answered that the Kalim of the Zayin Kalim are counted as a chelik of Binyan HaMikdash because they're kvuim b'mekoymom. They're chelik of the Mikdash. They have a place in the Mikdash, and therefore the chelik of the Mikdash. And there's a key b'mekoymom, and they have to be in that place. And therefore, the Rambam describes their place in Uchos Beis HaBechira in Perek Aleph Oloch Avav, when he's mavaya the Chalokah mitzvah Binyan HaMikdash, and the Mechilta is like that in Pashas Mishpatim, Perek Chof, in the Malbim, no Yisvei Chof, B'chol Asher Amarti Aleichem Tishomeru, Lo Manema Lefi Shuoimer V'samto Es HaShulchan Im Shinon Oive B'lo Yisaseh B'chol Asher Amarti. What does that mean? That according to one Tana, there's a lav if you put the keilim in a different place, because there's the kim mekoymom. That's what it's supposed to be. So the Ram says here at the end of the mitzvah a very interesting lashon. Ukva hisba'aru dinei mitzvah zo b'chlolo kloim binyan hamikdash v'tavnisoi u'binyan hamizbeach v'dinoi b'mesechta mechuberes lezo v'umesechas midas chen hisba'aru tavnis hamenorah v'ashulchan u'mizbech hazov b'heichol u'mekoymom b'heichol. Oh, what's he telling you, Dinim? Because that's the reason why they're part of the Mikdash, or that's an expression of that, because Mekom Be'echol, they have a specific place. B'gmor Menachos, B'yuma. Now, the Rambam, this is the last point in this mitzvah. The Rambam defines two groups at the end of this mitzvah. He defines a group of binyan hamikdash tavnisa binyan mizbeach v'dinoi, and then there's another group of tavnis hamenorah v'ashulchan mizbeach hazov mekoymom beheichol. So mikdash and mizbeach, he says binyan hamikdash, binyan hamizbeach, and menorah and shulchan v'zavav is tavnis, menorah tavnis. Because the Ram is very careful. Binyan was only said in mizbeach because the mizbeach in mikdash is mechuber lekarka, and the mizbeach is a binyan, and the others are kalim, and that part of the binyan is a tavnis. And that's the Gemara in Tzvachim on Chav Zayin Beis that the Gemara calls the Mizbeach Ritzva, because it's a part of the Guf HaMikdash. It's a binyan, and that's the law of Ismarich in Chdush Yagam V'Agrid in Peri Beis V'Chus B'Chetzes B'Chira Halacha Yud Zayin, that the Mizbeach is part of Guf HaMikdash, and it's a binyan. But Shulchan, Menorah, and Mizbach Hazov is not a Chelek Guf HaMikdash. It just has tavnis, and that's how the Rambam has two separate groups. There's Beis HaMikdash, and Mizbeach is binyan, and then there was tavnis of Kalim. Okay, now let's start the next mitzvah. Mitzvah Chaf Aleph. But mitzvah achas v'esrim, he should tzivonu Lirא min habayis, and that bayis was part of the original text. Hazeh haramus elov, which we don't know what that means. Haramus elov. The better is with kapach. Kapach says hanizka. It's referring to the base of Mikdash. Liru min habayis hazeh hanizka. Okay, Then, just before we get started, the Rambam here, just reading it is amazing. He says, Li'ra min habayis hazeh hanizka, this bayis, which he mentioned in the last mitzvah, ma'od ma'od. Okay. Now, to be frank with you, I tried to find if this is a very, very emphatic ma'od ma'od. If the Rambam does not use this expression in any other place in Sefer HaMitzvos, the only place, ma'od ma'od. And he says, Ad shenosim b'nafshenu masa pachad vayira. V'zehu moiros mikdosh. From Yisala mikdosh tiro. So the question is, what is this? What's going on over here? And what is the mitzvah? The mitzvah is to be afraid of the physical structure of the mikdosh. And the Ram says no. Both here in the Mishnah Torah, that the Yira is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As he says at the end of the mitzvah, Lo min ha-mikdosh nema gam kein, lo min ha-mikdosh ha-tayore, el mimi shepokar al mikdosh. And he does the same thing in Perek Zion of Hilchos Beis Bechira Loch Aleph. So now, one should ask the following question. Since the mitzvah is to Li'ra me Hashem, what's the difference between this mitzvah of Yiras HaMikdash and Yiras Hashem? Aseh Dalet, should all be one mitzvah. And the Rambam is coming to answer this question. Ma'ed, ma'ed. Shetzivonu li'ra min habayis hazeh, ma'ed, ma'ed. Ad shenosim b'nafshenu masa pachad vayira. And the explanation is, and what I want to tell you something, I'm not sure if I mentioned this. The Chinuch assumes that the mitzvah of Avos Hashem and Yiras Hashem and Metzias Hashem and Achdus Hashem are mitzvahs tmidios. And you constantly have to think about it. This is very troubling, because if everyone is constantly thinking about these four things, I'm not even sure how you can do these four things at the same time, because I think you can absolutely go, yeah. I think it's, intellectually and emotionally impossible, or maybe, I'm just a Katlakanya. So I thought, there's these mitzvahs of days at the beginning. It's not that you have to constantly obsess about Achdus and Metzias Hashem and Avos Hashem and Yiras Hashem. It's a mindset. That's where your mind is at. But in Yiras HaMikdosh, when you're in the Mikdosh, it's not enough to have a mindset. You have to be awe-inspired by the Mikdosh. You need Yiur b'Metzias. And that's the Ram stresses over here. Me'ed, me'ed, ad shenosim b'nafshenu, masa hapachad vayira. Okay. And this, I'll talk about this. I want to touch on this. When you talk about Yiras HaMikdosh, and Yiras Hashem in Mikdash, l'chera, it's not Yiras Ha'onesh, it's Yiras Ha'roimamus. So a priori, we understand the relationship between this mitzvah. Maybe you could have asked that it's one between in Mishnah Torah, where the mitzvah of Yiras Hashem is Yiras Ha'roimamus. But a priori, we'll see if this is true or not. The Rambam in Minyan HaMitzvos is mashma that the mitzvah of Yiras Hashem is Yiras Ha'onesh, at least the whole discussion, the way you read it. So the Chayr is no relationship to Mikdash, and the Chayr is no kasha, it doesn't have to talk so much. Nafshem Moed Moed. So that we have to deal with it. We'll deal with it soon. Remember, this is, so the mitzvah is Rikshe Pachad Va'arocha. Okay? The problem over here is going to be, and I don't know the answer, because the Rambam goes out of his way, V'hu Yis'aleh, Mikdashi Tirol. Okay? Then he says, V'gede Zeis Hayira, or maybe Kapach is even better, V'hagdoras, that's the V'gede is in V'tibin, and in Ibn Iyov, and Kapach is Hagdoras, I see him. The Rambam means he's defining the mitzvah with the Sifra. Kamoshe Zocho b'Sifra. Eze Yira, Moira, Shalikones, Habayis, V'laharbayis V'machloi, V'minoloi. So here, L'cheira is talking about physical things which he's enjoined from doing and Harabayis. And if that's the definition of mitzvah, you don't see the Ma'id Ma'id. And the Nosim B'nafshenu, you don't know how the Rambam is defining the mitzvah in this way, when this doesn't in any way say what the mitzvah is. Now, I'd like to tell you something. First of all, again, just one hour, I'm going to take a little Arabic over here. The Judah, which is the original Arab Moed, as I told you, is not found any other place. So he's talking about something very special over here. Moed. And then he's saying that the Shiur Moed is Ad Shenosim B'nafshenu Masa Pachad Vayira. And this is something special in this mitzvah, as opposed to Yiras Hashem. Now, I just want to tell you something else. The original Arabic of this word, Vayira, is not Stam Yira. The word in Arabic is Al-Rahava. Okay? And the Tirgum in Bloy is awe-inspiring, terrifying. That's Yiras Ha'roimamus. Now, I just want to tell you something very interesting. The Rambam in Mitzvah Dalid, the Mitzvah of Yiras Hashem, which a priori reading the text, he's talking about Yiras Ha'onesh, he uses this same word at the beginning of the mitzvah, this alava. So it means maybe there's an element of Yiras Ha'onesh also in Sefer HaMitzvos. And then the Rambam's question or discussion over here in the Moed makes sense in his frame of reference. Now, the Rambam mentions here he mentions, if you look at the mitzvah, he mentions Harabayis, which that's the Ram Shita, that the Harabayis is the rice and like the Mir in Yevomis, that's the Rabbonim. And he mentions Azorah. Sheino mutalon klal l'sheves bazora el malchi beis David. In both things, both the Inyan of Harabayis and Azorah is Mikdashi Tirol. So the question is, what's the difference between the dinim in Azorah and the dinim Harabayis? And if you look at it, the pshat is that in Harabayis, you shouldn't do things which lack covered, which are not mechubadik. But in Azorah, you have to be mechabed. And abstaining from things that lack a covered is not enough. And the Rambam and Perek, there's other dinim in Azor, which he doesn't mention over here, would all fit into it. In Perek Zayin of Hilchos Beis Bechira, Halacha Dalet in Hey, Kol Shehishlim Avoida Umistalek Loi Einu Yotze V'Achov Lehecho. He has to walk out of the Azor backwards because he has to always face the Hecho. That's covered. It's not walking out backwards a lack of cover because Azor requires cover. Elamalach hachogan is mat ma'at. Umahalech benachas al tzido at sheyetzim ben Azor. V'chulei. And then he says, V'chol nichlas Azor yahalech benachas b'mokim shemutaloi likonis l'shor. V'yira atzmoi shuhu oimei lifnei Hashem, k'mo shenema v'hoyu einai v'libi shom kol hayomim, u'mahalech be'emo u'b'yiro u'odo shenema b'veis elokim na'arach b'ro. It's also covered. Okay. Okay, let's stop here.